Hello, this is the last but one presentation in the series Modelling the Mind, and it's on consciousness and attention. Consciousness and attention is a particular area that has interested me, but in particular my colleague John Truscott, so a special acknowledgement to him for his cooperation. Together we created the modular cognition framework, which is in continual development, and that forms the basis of these series of presentations. Okay, so without further ado, let's crack on, and I'll start with a number, 95%. Right, that's often quoted as the amount of mental activity that happens to be subconscious at any given moment. It's a pretty arbitrary number, but it gives you the general idea that you're only conscious of a very small part of what's going on in your mind. And if we stick with that number, if we look at the 95% of the mind that I've sketched in the previous presentations and ask ourselves, is it all peace and tranquility? Well, you may remember I said absolutely not. It's a world in which there is conflict, competition, everything is moving and changing, and all this is in the subconscious, so that if you were aware of the 95%, it would quickly drive you mad. So perhaps that's a positive spin on the idea that we're only conscious of the 5%, even though of course it is a little unsettling if we have formerly thought that we were in control of everything. So there we are, conscious of 5%, and we'll stick with that, and now look at representations. Before we dive into consciousness and attention, just a little more about something which I have so far presented in the various graphics as a single little dot like this one. This happens to be a conceptual representation because I've put it in blue. What do we know so far? Well, we know that these dots in the network are not empty. They have content, different content. In this question, in the context of the conceptual system, they happen to have meaning content. Okay, and they can be activated more or less, and they have a resting level. So these things are what we know already. Let's now look more specifically at a single representation, which so far has been presented as a nice convenient little circle, and we're going to have to complicate that just a little bit, I'm afraid, to represent what really is going on. Let's take apple. Okay, apple is a simple concept, you might think. There it is in its current form. Let's expand it and see what's inside. Okay, so what we find inside is actually a complex representation, a complexity that perhaps has been hidden from you in the simpler graphics. But here it is, and I must say that this just represents only a small amount of the various ones that we would have to present if we were giving you a really comprehensive view of what Apple concept is for you or for me or any individual. But we'll just take a few examples. So let's say fruit would be part of it, edible, crunchy, tasty, hard, juicy, rounded, colours, perhaps red and green, and so on. So all of these together, associated together and co-activated together, all written in conceptual code in the conceptual system, all of these are part of the concept of apple, right? Now, this means that the simple concept of apple isn't actually simple at all. It's actually quite complicated. It's internally complicated. because it's made up of all these various little sub-representations, you might call them, okay, but each of them are individually representations, right? But it's externally complicated as well, because if you activate the apple meaning, not only do you have to activate all the various pieces that make up that apple, that complex of meanings that together form the notion of apple, but you have to activate, you do activate an enormous number of representations from other stores, other systems. Here are some examples. For example, crunchy, the meaning crunchy, is of course associated with a crunchy sound, or a set of sounds which you would call crunchy, and these are representations in the auditory system. Take tasty. Now tasty can't really be understood if it's not connected with a value from the affective system. In this case, tasty is a positive value, so it's only made positive because it is associated with a positive value. So whenever tasty is activated, this will be co-activated as well. In the same way, hard will be a somatosensory, it's something hard to touch, so it'll be a representation in the somatosensory system. And another perceptual system here would be the taste system, the gustatory system. So in the gustatory store we will certainly find a representation of juicy. So that meaning has to be connected with the association, with the representation of taste, which is the juicy taste. And juicy may also suggest a connection with the somatosensory system, of course. So this again is a simplification. Okay, and then of course there will be shape characteristics of an apple. It'll be rounded, and that will that will co-activate an association with a visual structure. And there will be colour representations which must be associated with colour representations in the visual system. So this gives you, and I have to add etc, 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 just to remind ourselves that this is just a small number of meanings that are forming the internal representation of apple, but which are also activating all sorts of other representations across the mind as a whole. So what turned out to be what was once a very simple concept when we first introduced it has turned out to be a very complex one, both internally and externally. And not forgetting, since I'm a linguist, so I can't forget this, I must add at least a few more details. The crunchy sound, which is represented in the auditory system, reminds me that there is also a sound apple, which is also a sound in the auditory system, and that is connected with our meaning of apple, of course, and that auditory, that sound, the speech sound, and I'm only talking about speech, not writing or signing or anything like that, that is connected with a speech structure, something that allows it to be analysed as a bit of language. So in this case, a phonological structure, and that phonological structure is connected, as we saw earlier, with a syntactic structure, that making that particular sound into a word which consists of a speech structure and a syntactic identity as a noun or a noun phrase, and that means it can be take part in a longer stretch of like a sentence, and it can be combined with other words, but only in ways in which nouns can be combined, and so forth. And this is connected back to the meaning of apple. So all of this is connected up together. So this is a dimension, the language dimension, which involves at least these three extra systems as well, not to speak of, you know, written and signed language. So now going to resting levels of activation. You may have noticed that the word green and the word red were in different sizes in the earlier slide. That was for a reason, and that was to make this point, and that is that each of these particular meanings that together make up the concept of apple will have their own individual resting levels. So if for you apples are predominantly green, and the green meaning is activated most frequently when you encounter green apples and no red ones, then of course this will have climbed to a very high resting level of activation, whereas the red one for you is a rarity. You might never have seen a red apple in real life, but you might have seen pictures of red apples, so it will be there in your concept of apple, but it will be very low down, right? So it won't dominate, as it were, when you think about apples. Now I have a set of questions to ask myself, as it were, and ask you. When and how do we become consciously aware of something like an apple? Well, you might have an answer to the when. More interesting in the current context is how. How do we become consciously aware of something like an apple? Well, current thinking, and of course it won't be everybody, but there's a strong school of thought which suggests that conscious experience is primarily associated with activation, and indeed very high levels of activation. So if we treat this uppermost level using our height metaphor, here are the resting levels down there. If something is activated, but activated really, really intensely, and it reaches this sort of upper 5% area, then it enters into conscious experience. That's what conscious is. So it's primarily to do with activation, but it is associated with synchronized activity. So if you're conscious of the meaning apple, if you become somehow conscious of apples or an apple, it will be a question of very high levels of a whole range of associations, of representations which are activated in synchrony together, and this will be across multiple locations, both in our kind of software map of the mind, but especially in the brain. So conscious activity is associated in neuroscience with synchronized activity across multiple locations. The whole brain is active when we think consciously of apples. There we have a representation at its resting level, and here it has been activated very, very intensively up to the 5% level, and it is and we become conscious of it in some sense. Okay. Second question is, and maybe this is a question for you, what kinds of representations do you think are regularly and frequently activated, every millisecond of your waking life, and maybe even to some extent in your dreaming life, but we'll leave that aside. And your answer may be perceptual representations, and that would be correct, because of course every millisecond of our waking life we need to be aware of our surroundings. We simply need it for day-to-day survival. So this means these representations in these systems are very regularly and frequently activated. They have very high representation levels, and they're all interconnected. So the system can almost be regarded as a single system when we become conscious. So all those external, you may have noticed that most of those external associations that I was talking about when I looked at the complex combination of representations that are involved in Apple, most of those were perceptual. So what have we got? Perceptual awareness, a high interconnectivity, that's the systems are very highly interconnected, high frequency of activation, typically very high, and very high resting levels, of course, as a result. Questions 3 and questions 4. So you're talking about consciousness, but what exactly is attention? Is that something radically and fundamentally different, or is it all bound up with the same story? And how do we focus on something? How do we attend to something in particular? And the answer is the following. Firstly, it is indeed part of the same story. It's all about activation. And when something is focused on, it's when one or more, even these high levels of representation that we've been talking about, when one of these representations is particularly highly activated relative to the other ones, so really, really highly activated. Take, for example, something which you might find surprising. Remember the red meaning in the conceptual combination that is part of the notion of Apple. Red was rather low down resting level, so normally speaking that wouldn't feature very much when you think of apples. Redness wouldn't. However, let's say you suddenly come across a whole lot of red apples. There will be a novelty effect. Because it's so rare, it will have a novelty value, and this boost from the affective system will mean that it will really soar into the upper levels. Here it is. So it's got this tremendous boost because suddenly it has a high value. It's novel, and we instinctively attend to novel things, right? So it's right up there. And so this is what happens when we focus, when our attention focuses on a red apple. That, in terms of the system I've been developing for you, is what happens. And the fifth and the last question, extremely tricky perhaps, but I feel I have to deal with it, is what about thinking? What about thoughts? There's more to awareness, by the way, but we just don't have time for everything. But let's just deal with thoughts. Now, thinking is something that humans do. It's not clear exactly to what extent primates think, but even if they do, the kind of things that they think about will be fairly simple. But human beings are able to think in very complex ways, and thoughts are characteristically something of which we are conscious. Consciousness is part of the notion of thinking, right? So what happens? Well, the fact is that our thoughts, this is a short, condensed answer, of course, but our thoughts are expressed as conceptual representations. They're meaning representations, right? Now, these are always subconscious. We're not aware directly of them. But how do they enter? How do we become conscious of thoughts? Because thoughts in themselves are very abstract things. How do we actually become conscious of them? The fact is that they come to us in perceptual form. Now, you may remember when I detailed all the external associations that we might include when we talk about the Apple concept. Many or most of those were perceptual. So when the apple concept is activated, all those perceptual ones will be activated as well. And as you know, perceptual representations are typically possessed of very high resting levels and are typically conscious. So in a sense, we're aware of our thoughts as percepts. So what is conceptual becomes perceptual. And that's how we become aware of them. And of course, as we develop our various meanings one after the other to form more complex meanings in sequence, then the perceptual associations appear in our mind, in our conscious mind, in the same order. So these here is, as you see, the conceptual representation of apple sitting there as a hub, and at the center of our whole network, and many of the associations are in the perceptual systems, and these will be activated, and this is how we become conscious of our thoughts. Now, you may have to mull over that afterwards and think about it. So I'll leave you with a simpler notion, a simpler kind of reflection, and that is the consequence of this very intense activation that is required for the mind and indeed the brain if we want to be conscious of something. So sustained very high activation is effortful. In physical terms, it uses up calories. We know that a lot of thinking, especially intense thinking, is very tiring. Okay, so it's an interesting fact that high levels of activation are effortful, and since 95% of the activity in our brain goes on in our subconscious, it means that at this particular level 95% of our mind is functioning in a resource-friendly way. So that allows us only to spend calories and effort when we're actually using the 5%. And with that thought, and I hope that this presentation hasn't caused too much loss of calories and headaches, I will finish. And next time I will try to put it all together into a big picture and keeping things as simple as possible. This wasn't entirely possible in this presentation because it's a very complex area, but I hope that at least I've given you some sense of what happens in the mind according to this perspective when we become conscious of things, and indeed when we attend and focus on something in particular. So next time I hope you will wind up the series with me on putting it all together and the big picture. And until then, I'll wish you goodbye.